Well, turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis, chapter 29. And as you're turning there, let me give you a little bit of background information that you need to know. The next 3 chapters cover the time that Jacob spent outside of Canaan, and it covers a time period of about 20 years. So Jacob didn't return home until he was in his 60s, and by the time he did return home, his mother was dead. She'd already passed away, and something that most of us don't ever think about. Now, most commentators treat this period of Jacob's life as if it were a punishment from God for the way that he treated his brother Esau, but that's really a distorted view of this period of Jacob's life. And the reason I say that is because this was really a very happy and prosperous time for Jacob. Believe it or not, it really was. Yes, he had his ups and downs, and yes, Laban deceived him, mistreated him, and took advantage of him, but God blessed Jacob in spite of all of that. So as we go through the next 3 chapters, let's make sure that we look at the good times, not just the bad. Because, of course, this story is going to focus in on certain situations. And when we look at just the situation, it's like, oh my, seems like everything's going wrong for Jacob. But really it's not. It's just that those are critical points or critical times in this 20-year period. And we need to keep the right perspective on this. So turn with me, if you would, to verse number 1. And let's study at least the first part of chapter 29. Notice what verse 1 says. Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. In other words, after Jacob's experience in Bethel, where he had this divine dream and God spoke to him, Jacob continued on with his journey. Now, if you translated this literally from the original Hebrew, it would say, then Jacob lifted up his feet and he came to the land of the eastern peoples. Now, the phrase lifted up his feet is a figure of speech that we still use today. And it means the opposite of dragging your feet. How many of you have ever been in a hurry and you are walking along with someone and it seems like they're so behind, so you say, quit dragging your feet. Anyone ever said that? Well, what's interesting is dragging your feet means that you're going slow, but picking up your feet is just the exact opposite of that. It means that you're picking up the pace. So what this is actually saying in the original Hebrew is that after Jacob's experience in Bethel, he picked up the pace. Now, why did he pick up the pace? Because now he's excited. You know, it was a little bit sad. He was having to leave his home, and under the circumstances in which he had to leave, it really wasn't the best of times. And yet when he gets to Bethel and he has this divine dream and God speaks to him, and God promises to not only provide for him, but to protect him wherever he goes, it puts a spring in his step. Because now Jacob is excited about his future, and as a result of that, he picks up the pace. And eventually he arrives at his destination, Haran, probably a little bit earlier than he had originally planned. So Haran was also known as the land of the eastern peoples. Now, what's kind of interesting is when you look at this on a map, you would never guess that. Because Haran is more north of Canaan than it is east. But we have to remember this, that the descendants of the people living in Haran came from the east. So Haran was known as the land of the people of the east. And so that's exactly what it's saying there. Now look at verses 2 through 8. It says, there he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds, my brothers, where are you from? We're from Haran, they replied. He said to them, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Yes, we know him, they answered. Then Jacob asked them, is he well? Yes, he is, they said, and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep. Look, he said, the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture. We can't, they replied, until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep. Now, this well was probably located just on the outskirts of Haran. And let me explain why I say that. Because there's a lot of little details here that if you don't understand the culture at the time and the customs of the time, then you really won't pick up on it. And you really miss so many great details in this story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these little details and try to pull them out. It means we're going to go a little bit slower through chapter 29 and probably chapter 30, but I think it's going to be well worth it. Now, this well, as I said, was probably right on the outskirts of Haran. First of all, the shepherds at the well were young boys. I'm talking about preteen boys. And young boys kept their flocks close to home. Now, we don't think much about that, but it's true. They would keep their flocks closer to home while their older brothers took their flocks further away to graze. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for the older shepherds, the older sons of a family, to take their flocks to graze at a location that were several days away. Let me give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 37, verses 12 through 14. This is the story about Joseph. We're all kind of familiar about this. Joseph was Jacob's favorite. And he's getting ready to go check on his brothers. So follow along with me as I read verses 12 through 14. Soon after this, Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. When they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing their sheep at Shechem. Get ready and I will send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. "Go and see how your brothers and the flocks are getting along," Jacob said. "Then come back and bring me a report." So Jacob sent him on his way, and Joseph traveled to Shechem from their home in the valley of Hebron. Now, most of us don't pick up on this because we're not familiar with Israel. And so we don't realize how far away they were. So what Jacob is telling Joseph is, "I haven't heard from your brothers in a while." And when he says in a while, he's not talking about a few days. He's talking about a few weeks. Because Hebron is actually about 45 miles away from Shechem. In fact, let me show you this on a map. Right down here is Hebron. Back in Abraham's day, it was called Mamre. But this is Hebron, and the valley of Hebron is right there. Now, Shechem is all the way up here. Can you see how far it is? To go there, you have to go from Hebron to Bethlehem to Jerusalem. That says Salem there, but it was the city of Salem, and that's where Jerusalem gets its name. Then you went on up to Bethel, and then there's Shechem. Now, what most people don't realize is it's 45 miles away. Now think about that. They're pasturing the flocks 45 miles away. By the time Joseph gets there, they're gone. He can't find his brothers. Dad sent him out to go find his brothers, to check on them, just to make sure everything's all right. He gets there. He can't find them anywhere. So he runs to a stranger and says, "Excuse me, have you seen my brothers?" And they said, "Who are your brothers?" He tells them, and he says, "I think they said something about going up to Dothan." And so here is Dothan. Dothan is 60 miles away from Hebron. But the point that I want to make is this. The younger boys, the preteen boys, they kept their flock close to home, while their brothers, their older brothers, would graze their flocks further from home. So if these shepherds were young boys, and they were, and I'm going to prove why in just a little bit, that means that this well was very close to their home because they weren't allowed to travel very far with their flock. It was just too dangerous. And I want you to think about this. Just imagine if you lived in this time and you had 4 sons. The youngest is 6 or 7 years old. The oldest is probably 18 to 20 years old. Now, you have several flocks because you're pretty prosperous, and you can't keep them all together because there's not enough pasture land. They just graze everything to the point where there's nothing left. Plus, you have to be able to share water, so what you do is you divide these flocks up into 4 different flocks. Where would you ask them to go? Well, of course, the 6-year-olds, you want to keep close to town. You want to make sure that you can look out and you can see them. If they get in trouble, they're there. If there's any problems, they can run home, or you can get there very quickly. And so the young boys, the 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, they still had a flock, but they stayed very close to home. While your older 18 to 20-year-old son, he might have to take them 20, 30, 35, 40, 45 miles away to be able to continue to graze and to be able to get adequate water. And we forget about that. But remember the story of Abraham and Lot. They were both so wealthy that it got to the point where they said, you know, the land can't contain us. We can't even stay together. You go one way and I'll go the other. And even then, Abraham had so many flocks that he had different people taking care of his flocks 30, 40, 45 miles away. And we find this with Jacob here. Now, How do I know that the shepherds around this particular well were young boys? Well, several reasons. First of all, notice that the stone that covered the well wasn't rolled away until all the flocks were there. Look back at verse number 3. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds, plural, would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Now, that tells us that it required more than one of them to move the stone. But later on in the story, as we read just a few verses down, we find that when Rachel comes, Jacob wants to water her sheep. So he runs over there and he moves the stone and waters her sheep and then moves the stone back. Now, wait a minute. Was Jacob this big, hurly man? Was he a person that had Samson-like strength? If he was, why was he scared of Esau? No. He wasn't this big, burly guy with superhuman strength. The truth of the matter is, he was a man and they were boys. And so they would have to wait until the other flocks came, and it would take several of the boys working together to be able to move the stone off and water it and then move the stone back. Secondly, I want you to notice that Jacob rebuked the shepherds. Look at verse number 7. Look, he said, the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to the pasture. Now, I want you to understand this is a rebuke and a command. He's rebuking them because, wait a minute, you shouldn't be here just waiting around. These sheep are thirsty. You need to water them, and then you need to take them out to pasture. Look, the sun's still high up. Now you water them and get out of here. Now, listen to me. In that culture at that time, Jacob wouldn't have done that if these shepherds were men. In fact, that would have been considered rude and socially unacceptable. And in that culture, he might have got whooped. You understand what I'm talking about? But it was totally acceptable to speak to children in that way. So again, these shepherds must have been boys rather than men. The other reason we know that this well must have been on the outskirts of Haran is because Rachel was able to leave the sheep and run to her home. She was able to run to her father. You see, if she hadn't been close to home, she would have never left her sheep. But not only that, she wouldn't have been able to run to her home. It would have been too far away. So this well was just on the outskirts of Haran. And so when we're reading the story, we realize that there was this well here. It had to be close to town, but he still couldn't see the city, so it was probably just over a little hill. He came to this place. Haran's just over the hill. Here's this well, and you've got these shepherd boys with their flocks all together. Now, when Jacob sees this well and the shepherds around it, he went over to gather information. And the first thing he wanted to know is where they were from. You know, it's not like it is today. You don't have these big highway signs that tell you that you're coming to Muskogee 5 miles away or you're entering Fort Gibson. You didn't have that. So he comes upon this well and he sees these young boys here. He realizes because they're young boys, there's got to be a town close by. There's no way that these 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old boys would be out here alone by themselves 10, 15 miles away from town. So the first thing he wants to know is, where are you from? And they tell him, Haran. Now, they didn't have to tell him that they were close to Haran because he already knew that by their ages. So he asked about the next thing. He asked them if they knew Laban, which of course they did. Why? Because Laban was a very wealthy person. And we know that for several reasons, which I'm going to explain in just a little bit, and also next week too. And then Jacob asked them if Laban was doing well. Look at verse number 6. Then Jacob asked them, is he well? Yes, he is, they said. And here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep. Now, I want you to underline the word well. That word appears twice in this verse in the original Hebrew. Now, if you're reading this in the King James Version, the New American Standard, you'll see this word well appears twice, but here in the NIV, it only appears once. But I want you to understand that in the original Hebrew, this word appears twice. Both times it's translated from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. In fact, shalom is the word that the Jews use today to greet people and also to say goodbye. If you go over to Israel and you see someone and you make eye contact, it's polite to say shalom, and they will say shalom back. And then when you leave, you will say the very same thing. It's kind of like hello and goodbye, but it literally means peace. But the reason you speak this as you leave is because it's actually a blessing. It means peace in the sense of good health, wealth, and tranquility. So when you say shalom to someone, you're wishing them good health, wealth, and tranquility. And you say this when you greet them and when you say goodbye, because it's really a blessing. So when Jacob asked them if Laban was doing well, he wasn't inquiring about his health. He was asking about his health, his wealth, and his family. In other words, he was asking, is he blessed? Is he shalom? To which they replied, yes, he is. Yes, he's shalom. He's healthy, he's wealthy, and all of his family members are doing well. And then they said, and look, here comes Rachel, his daughter, with her sheep. Look at verse number 6. Then Jacob asked them, is he well? Yes, he is, they said. And here comes his daughter, Rachel, with the sheep. Now, you need to understand something. It wasn't customary for a woman to be a shepherd. And sometimes we don't pick up on that because we find several instances in the Bible where women are shepherds. Can you think of another example or another instance in the Bible where women were shepherds? Moses. Yes, when he's running away from Egypt. And of course, he finds his wife, Zipporah, but she is also a shepherd. So when we're reading through the Bible, especially in the Pentateuch, sometimes we get the wrong idea. We get the idea that it was customary for women to be shepherds, but it wasn't. You see, a shepherd was considered to be a man's job. But if a man didn't have enough sons to watch the flocks, or he was so wealthy that he had more sheep than he had sons, they needed to be divided up. Maybe he had so many sheep that he needed to have 7 or 8 flocks and he only had 6 sons. Then what do? Well, normally you would hire men out, but sometimes if you were cheap, you wouldn't do that. You would have one of your older daughters become a shepherd. Then and only then were daughters used in that way. But, and this is what you need to understand, because this is important to the story. If your daughter was a shepherd, they would keep their flock close to home just like the little boys, while the older sons grazed their flocks further away. Now, Rachel had brothers. We know that because as we're reading through the story, we find out that the brothers get upset at Jacob. They're kind of mad at Dad. They think that Jacob's taking advantage of them and he's taken away all their wealth. So as we read the story, we understand that she had brothers. So the reason that Rachel was a shepherd was because Laban was wealthy and he had more sheep than he had sons. But we also find out as we read through the story that he's a tightwad. Man, he loves money. And because he loves money, he's not going to get a hireling, or if he does, he's going to make sure that they can give him more than what he expects from just anyone else. So when Jacob asked if Laban was blessed, shalom, and they said, yes, he is, and Rachel is coming with her flocks, that's his daughter, it meant that he had so many flocks, his daughter Rachel had to be a shepherd. And that's just one of the reasons that we know that Laban was a very wealthy man. There's other reasons, but we'll have to wait until we get to the wedding ceremony to be able to see that, which is still in this chapter, but we won't be able to get to that tonight. Now, let's look at verses 9 through 14. While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well, and he watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and his son to Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home, and there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, you are my own flesh and blood. And Jacob stayed with him for a month. Now I hope you noticed that verse number 9 says that Rachel was a shepherd, which tells us 2 things. Number 1, that this wasn't something that she was doing temporarily. No, this was her job. This is what she did every day. That's why she was referred to as a shepherd. If this was a one-time event or she did it every once in a while, it would not have said that she was a shepherd. But this was her occupation. Rachel was a shepherd. The second thing that it tells us is that she was at least 15 years old, if not older. Now, if you read a lot of rabbinic literature, it will say that she is 14 years old here, but really they need to pay attention to their own customs, especially at that time, and they would agree with me that she was at least 15 years old. And let me explain why I say that. You see, it was common for preteen boys, 6, 7, 8, and 9, to be shepherds. And the older they got, the further they were allowed to graze their sheep away from the home. But my point is this: it wasn't uncommon to see 6-year-olds as shepherds. Girls, on the other hand, needed to be trained in doing domestic chores. So the very first 14 years of a girl's life was dedicated to helping in the home and learning how to do domestic chores. You see, it wasn't like it is today. You couldn't go to the country store. Well, today it's Walmart, but even if you went back 40, 50 years, you couldn't go to the country store and just buy anything that you wanted. No. You had to produce much of what you had. In fact, you would shear your own sheep. You would take the wool, and if you go with me to Israel, we'll go to Nazareth, and we'll actually go to a village that's set up to be just like it was in the days of Jesus. And you'll be able to see how they would take wool and they would make their own yarn, and then how they would weave that yarn into all different types of clothing and blankets and anything that they needed. And you had to do all of this. Now, no man wanted to marry a woman who did not know how to take care of a home, how to take care of a family. So in that culture, the first 14 years of a girl's life was dedicated to learning the domestic chores. And so you weren't able to work outside of the home if you were needed to do that until after the age of 14. Now, rabbinic literature says when you turned 14, you could, but when you begin to study things that are outside of Jewish literature, and then you take that into consideration with what Jewish literature tells you, you realize, no, they had to go through their 14th year, and so she would have had to have been at least 15 years old. She's now reached the age where she's learned all of her responsibilities and how to take care of a home so that she can be a good wife, but daddy needs her, and so she goes out and she becomes a shepherd. Now, this is interesting. A girl wasn't allowed to be a shepherd, as I said, until she was 15 years old, and then she had to keep her flock close to home, where all of the little boys were keeping their flocks. And the reason she had to do that is because no respectable family wanted any woman in their home hanging out with men. And so if you had a daughter who had to be a shepherd, you wanted to make sure that she never was hanging out with other teenage boys or older men, because older men took advantage of younger girls. So they had to keep their flock where the little boys kept their flock, so you wouldn't have to worry about your daughter being alone or around other boys. So she would have had to have been at least 15 years old, and she would only be around 6, 7, 8, and 9-year-olds, possibly 10 or 11, but it wouldn't have been any older than 11 years old. And those are good things to know, because she's a girl. And these 6, 7, and 8-year-olds are waiting for all of the other flocks to come because they can't roll the stone off. But they probably looked forward to the time when Rachel came, because at 15 years old, she was probably stronger than any of the boys. And she was probably the one that had to roll the stone away. So all of these details are included in the story, and they help us to understand what's going on. Laban is a very wealthy man, and he has more flocks than sons, but we see that he's also cheap. He won't go out and hire people to be shepherds, even to hire maybe younger boys who would be able to do this. Nah, he's got plenty of family members, and they can take care of their own. Rachel's at least 15 years old. Though rabbinic literature says she's around 14, I would beg to differ, and she's about 15. Now, this is interesting because this is going to put her somewhere around 22 years old when she gets married. Now, here's what's interesting. That's old by their standards. In fact, at 15 years old, to find out that she's not already in a prearranged marriage, what's wrong with this picture? Something's not right here. Now, as we read along in the story, and most of you have, this is a very familiar story that you've studied in Sunday school, you find out that when Laban tricks Jacob, what does he say? In our customs, the older must be married before the younger. Remember that? And we're going to find out that Leah is not a very pretty girl. And so Rachel can't even enter into a prearranged marriage until Leah is married. So here she is, 15 years old, and as we read through the story, she is a beautiful girl with a great figure. Yeah, the Bible says that. And so now you see this beautiful girl with this great figure, and she's very industrious. She's a hard worker. She has great character. Why isn't she already in a prearranged marriage? Why isn't she spoken for? Well, these are the things that we should know. And as we're reading through the story and we see that she's a shepherd, everyone who understood Jewish customs and understood the customs of the time would say, this is a 15-year-old girl. Why isn't she supposed to be married or getting married? Very interesting. Now, I want you to notice the first thing that Jacob does when he sees Rachel. Look at verse number 10. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and he rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well, and he watered his uncle's sheep. Now, you need to remember the Bible only says what it needs to say, but it also gives you every detail it needs to. It doesn't say that Jacob went over there and he rolled up his sleeves, and he grunted and he sweated and he moved that stone away. No. Again, if you understand the culture and the customs of the time, you understand these are little boys. And he's a man among boys. Rachel comes, she doesn't think anything about it. He just goes over there and he just rolls the stone away, and he waters the sheep. But this also says a lot about Jacob's character. Think about it. He's traveled over 500 miles to get here. And it's taken him at least a month to reach this destination. And the first thing he does when he sees Rachel is to roll the stone away and to water her sheep. Now, what does this tell us about Jacob? It tells us that he's a worker. While Esau was running around hunting and fishing, Jacob was working and learning the family business. This is why he told the little boys that they needed to water the sheep, and then they needed to get the sheep back to the pasture. You see, they liked sitting there. They liked waiting until all of them got there. They got a chance to play with each other and talk a little bit, and they kind of keep one eye to make sure the parents weren't coming, because then they really have to get to it. But if mom and dad weren't coming, then this was a time for them to have a good excuse. We couldn't get the rock off. But you see, when he gets there, he says, hey, boys, you're big enough, 2 or 3 of you. You move that stone, you water your sheep, and you get them out to pasture. In other words, he was telling those boys, quit being lazy and do your job. So when he saw Rachel, the first thing he did was he watered her sheep, because work was the top priority. And only after he watered her sheep did he even introduce himself. I mean, here she comes, and all of a sudden she just sees this man that she's never seen before. He walks over there, he rolls the stone away. In fact, let me kind of give you the picture of this, because probably most of you have the wrong picture. Let's suppose that it was a circular well. It's probably a cistern that was there. Some type of spring underground ran into it, or it's underneath the water table. They built this up in a circle with stone, and then they put a big stone over it, and it had a hole in the middle. And then they put a stone on top of that. And the reason they did that is because they didn't want dirt, they didn't want animals, anything falling into the well, and maybe an animal couldn't get out, and then it died, and it would contaminate the water. And it's all about the water. So that's why they would usually put the big stone around it so nothing could get into it, and then they would cut out a little hole in the middle, because that big stone is too big to get on and off. And then all you had to do is just reach over, push that stone away, and then you could draw the water up and water your sheep. And so the first thing he did when he saw Rachel is he just walked over there, he pushed the stone away, and then he drew up water, and he went over to these troughs, and he poured the water in, and he watered all of her sheep, and he didn't even introduce himself. And Rachel's looking at this, and she's thinking, who is this man? Because each of the shepherds would have had their own watering troughs, so that when you finished with yours, they'd go over to theirs and start putting theirs in. and he chose hers. But then after he does that, he goes over and he introduces himself. First of all, it says he gives her a kiss. Now, this wouldn't have been a kiss on the lips. In fact, usually, members of the opposite sex did not kiss each other unless they were married or it was a father-daughter, father-son thing. But it was very common for members of the same sex, as gross as it sounds, to kiss each other, not on the lips, but on the cheeks. So he does something very unusual. After he waters the sheep, and she's standing over there thinking, who in the world is this man? He walks over and he kisses her on the cheek. It says one, it's singular, kiss. Explains who he is. And then he begins weeping. And then it dawns on her. This is Aunt Rebecca's boy. This is my cousin. This is from the family of the family that my mom and dad are always talking about. And she gets so excited that she takes running off for home and she leaves her sheep there. Very interesting. Look at verses 11 and 12. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. Now, where was Jacob when Rachel ran off? He stayed with the sheep. He stayed with the sheep. He stayed behind to watch the sheep and to let them eat. Why? Because work comes first. So no matter how bad he wanted to go to Laban, he didn't follow Rachel. He stayed behind and he took care of the sheep. In fact, I have to be honest with you, when I'm thinking about this and I kind of put myself in Jacob's place, I bet you 10 to 1 that he was tickled to see Rachel get so excited that she forgot about the sheep and that she took off running from home. Can you see why I say that? Here's a man that's in his early 40s. We know he was at least 40 years old. Why? Because Esau got married when he was 40, and right before he leaves for Haran, what does Mama say? I am sick and tired of these Hittite women. And she tells him this because what she's saying is, I'm sick and tired of Esau's wives. Well, Esau didn't get married until he was 40. Right? And they were twins. So this is one of the reasons why Jacob has come in the first place, is to find a wife. So he's in his early 40s. She's probably 15 years old. And she gets so excited, she forgets about the sheep and she takes off running. Now, I'm thinking about this because, I'm 51 years old. I'm thinking about him being 41, 42 years old. And there's this 15-year-old girl. And he does this for her, and she's over there in astonishment. And then he introduces himself, kisses her on the cheek, and explains who he is. And she gets so excited, all of a sudden she just takes off. That probably tickled him. Now, in my book, Jacob was a catch. He was a catch as a son-in-law. And I'm saying this as a father who has 2 daughters. I have to be honest with you. As a father, very few men are worthy enough to marry your daughters. I'll be honest. My wife will tell you this is true. I don't even bother to learn their names until it's serious and they could be a son-in-law. It probably took 9 months before I knew Aaron's name. I called him Eric for I can't tell you how long. And my girls would just giggle and they'd, Dad, it's Aaron. I said, I don't care what his name is. He's doofus to me. And not because I'd ever met him. But it's like, he's going to have to be a special guy to be worthy enough to marry my daughter. And, I have one of the greatest son-in-laws. He is a hard worker, great character, great integrity. I couldn't be more proud of him. I think he's the best son-in-law that a man could have. I'm praying for my other son-in-law. It's kind of funny. Now, Macy wasn't dating this guy, but she has a guy that's going through the same program, and he's from Michigan. And it was Thanksgiving. He couldn't go home, and so she said, do you mind if he comes to our house for Thanksgiving? And his name was Vlado. He's a Serb. He actually lived through the Serbian War, and so he had come over to America. Speaks decent English, but he came home, and his name was Vlado, but I couldn't get that down. And so he was Nikolai to me. And so I called him Nikolai. And of course, all the girls just giggle and say, Dad, I'm sorry, Vlado. That's just my dad. And I said, it doesn't matter if his name's Vlado, Nikolai, whatever. Nikolai's a good Serbian name. That's what I'll call you, son. Because it really doesn't matter. You're not dating my girl. I'm not going to allow you to date my daughter. Now, I'm saying all of this because I want you to understand, as I'm reading through this story, some of you would probably be thinking that you would not have Jacob as a son-in-law, but as I'm reading through this story, I'm seeing it so totally different than the majority of Western Christians, because I'm reading this from a Jewish perspective. And as I said, as I look at him being a plain man and a man of the tents, and I understand what that word plain means, it means he was a righteous, godly man. And I see what a hard worker he was. And I see everything that he does. And he was not the initiator of this plot to deceive his father. Actually, that came from Mama, and it put him in a dilemma. And we're going to find out that Laban does the same thing to his daughter. Puts her in a pickle. What does she do? Does she obey her father or disobey? And so I'm looking at all of this, and I come to the conclusion that Jacob was a catch as a son-in-law. He had character, he was responsible, and he was a hard worker. It irritated him, even to see these little 6, 7, and 8-year-old boys not doing their job. And I know that because he wouldn't have said anything to him if he didn't really care, if he thought it was cute. Oh, you boys, you really need to be working. No! He rebukes them. You water your sheep. The sun's still high up. You get these sheep watered. This is not good for them. And you get them back out in the pasture. We can't do it because it takes several of us. There's 3 of you at least, or 2 because it says shepherds. Anyways, I want you to look at verse number 13 again. Now, as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and he kissed him and he brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Now, why did Laban come running when he heard the news about Jacob? Now, in that culture, you really didn't do that. Not if you're dignified. This is a wealthy man. But Laban comes running. Well, there's 2 reasons why he came running. The first reason was because he remembered what had happened the last time someone came from Abraham's family. Do you remember the story? Abraham's servant came, and he came bringing expensive gifts and jewelry, looking for a wife for Isaac. And his sister Rebekah was chosen. And they all received expensive gifts. Turn back to Genesis chapter 24, verse number 53. Notice what it said in that story. Then he brought out beautiful silver and gold jewelry and expensive clothing, and he presented them to Rebekah. He also gave expensive presents to her brother and mother. So the last time this happened, a servant came and he brought a lot of expensive gifts with him. And I'm sure Laban wanted to know if that was going to happen again. So he took off running in order to find this person to see, why have you come? Now, the second reason was because he hadn't seen Rebekah or anyone from her family in over 60 years. Now, people, all you have to do is do the math. Remember, Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. And if you remember the story, she couldn't conceive. And finally, when she did, she thought that something was wrong. And so she went to ask the Lord about it. And he said, you have twins in your womb. Remember the story? But how old was she when she conceived? Well, the Bible says that Isaac was 60 when the twins were born. So if he was 40 when he got married, 20 years passed before they had children. Now, Jacob is at least 40 years old when he goes to Haran. So Laban hasn't seen anyone in Rebekah's family for over 60 years. So he comes running to see them, to find out what's happening. He's just happy they're here. Now, look at the last part of verse 13 again. He embraced him, talking about Jacob, and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all things. Whoa. This says a lot about Jacob's character. I don't know if he specifically told him about his and Rebekah's deception with his father, tricking him to believe that he was Esau. But notice that it says that Jacob told him all these things. The way that it's stated in the original Hebrew means the things we've been reading about. All these things that we've been reading about. And what have we been reading about? The birthright. the blessing, the deception of Isaac. So, in other words, he told them why he had come. He told him that his father Isaac had blessed him with the birthright, even though he wasn't the oldest. And that Esau, his brother, who was the oldest, was angry and had threatened to kill him. And that his mother had told him that he needed to come to her family up to Laban until Esau cooled down. And that while he was there, he was supposed to find a suitable bride from Laban's family. But all in all, he probably wouldn't be there but just for a few days. Remember, that's what Mama had told him. Let's go back and look and see specifically what Mama had told Jacob right before he left. Look back at chapter 27, verses 43 through 45. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, and arise, flee to Haran to my brother Laban, and stay with him, how long? A few days. Ha yom. Yom is the word for day. Ha means the day or today. And so he comes along and says, Shtayim yom, which means several days or 2 days or more. So what he's saying is, and stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides and he forgets what you did to him. Then I shall send and get you from there. Now notice what she says. Stay there and I will send someone to get you. Now, again, to make sure that you're following along, how long did she tell Jacob to stay with Laban? Just a few days. Look at verse 44 again. And stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides. So Jacob did not intend to stay for more than a few days because he thought that any day now, Mama's going to send a messenger telling him it's time to come home and that Esau's gotten over it. But not only that, when this messenger comes, he's probably going to bring expensive gifts just like Abraham's servant came because she told me, you come find a suitable bride. So he's telling Laban, she told me to come up here and find a suitable bride from your family. And you know, when he comes, because I'm supposed to bring or supposed to find a suitable bride, he will bring the bridal gifts. The presents. So guess what? Jacob stays with Laban as a guest for a month. But at the end of the month, Laban, because he is a cheap guy, doesn't like that he's a guest. You're in my home. And he's a hard worker. I'm sure he's helping, but you know, how long are you going to stay as an extended guest? We've been here a month. Notice what verse 14 says. Then Laban said to him, you are my own flesh and blood. And Jacob stayed with him for a month. Now we know the rest of the story. How long did he stay with him? 20 years. Why does it say a month? Because he stayed with him for a month as a guest. Both of them expecting at any time a messenger coming with Mama, and there would be camels loaded with bridal presents because she told me to pick a bride and they will bring the bridal price. But after a month, Laban says, but we have to understand hospitality. So next week when we pick it up in verse 15, we see the interesting way that Laban presents himself to Jacob and why he enters into this agreement to work for 7 years.